Hello, hello, hello. Hi, everybody. I know it's been a minute, so good afternoon, good morning, maybe even good night. And no, we are not done with the the essay style videos. As you can see, I've been kind of like going into this whole psychological route, exploring different versions of love, archetypes of characters, and a more African American, I guess you could say, centralized idea. Mostly because I feel like those stories aren't highlighted. And as I said before, the channel Eternalized does a wonderful job of explaining certain archetypes, especially within myth and folklore, that truly help one to perhaps even uncover some things about their own soul. But I just wanted to say hi and let y'all know. And my apologies for the last episode. I know the music or the voice levels weren't quite correct. Not sure what happened in the recording. But yes. Anyways, enjoy the episode. In a random place, perhaps an ancestral place of our collective memory, there is a story that we all carry. It is the myth, and myth in its original definition of the original garden, the story of Adam and Eve. Before history began, there were laws, economic systems, or structured social hierarchies. There was a state of simple, unreflected allness. When the first partners looked at one another in the light of the first dawn, they did not see an adversary, they did not see a competitor, a threat, or a stranger who needed to be conquered, managed, or defended against. They saw their own reflection. They experienced a love that was immediate, maybe even transparent, and completely free from fear. In this psychological state, there was no division between the inner world and the outer world. The soul was undivided, and love was as natural as breathing. In the spiritual traditions of West Africa, the same primordial balance is represented through the divine forces of the Orishas. We see it in the relationship between Shango, the god of lightning, fire, and really masculine power, and Oshun, the goddess of the sweet waters, beauty, intimacy, and divine feminine love. They were not in competition, they were cosmic coordinates of a single flowing energy. The fire Shango required the cool, sweet waters of Oshun to keep the world from burning, and the waters of Oshun needed the heat of Shango to dance and rise to the heavens. But to step into human history is to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It is to enter a world of painful opposites. The moment we become conscious of ourselves, we begin to divide our world. We label things as light or dark, good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable. We split our own psyche into two main parts. First, we build the persona, the conscious social mass, the part of ourselves we accept and proudly show to the world to secure belonging and safety. Second, we create the shadow, the dark, silent basement of the mind where we hide everything about ourselves that we think is too dangerous, too weak, or too ugly for the world to see. Four, the African American love of this journey into the world of division was not a gentle nor a natural transition. It was a sudden, violent, and a catastrophic exile. The transatlantic slave trade did not just cross an ocean, it ruptured an ecosystem of relationship. It tore away the ancient social structures where the spirit containers and the ancestral protectors that once held the balance between the masculine and the feminine. When a people are subjected to generations of systemic trauma, their psychological survival depends on the ability to adapt quickly. In a world where your physical body is not safe, where your humanity is systemically denied, and where your family can be torn apart at any moment, you cannot afford the luxury of being completely vulnerable. You have to build armor. You have to create a mass so heavy and so strong that no weapon of the outer world can pierce it. This is where the psychological tragedy of Black love begins. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, warned us of a fundamental law of the mind, the persona. The social mask we put on to survive stands directly opposite of our unconscious shadow. The stronger, more rigid, and more impenetrable our survival mask becomes, the more explosive, wounded, and neglected our unconscious shadow becomes. When we wear our survival mask for too long, they begin to stick to our skin. We forget who we are underneath the armor, and we look at the person we love and we no longer see them. We only see our unhealed wounds, our own hidden fears, and our own unexpressed grief projected onto their face. To understand why African American women, men and African American women stand face to face today with so much defensive armor, we must look directly into the fire of the history. We must have the courage to examine how the system of chattel slavery systemically targeted the very core of African American relational life. Under the brutal laws of the plantation, the enslaved African American body was classified not as human being, but as property, on the same legal level as livestock, but often seen as lower because property cannot enter into legal contracts. Enslaved people were forbidden from legally marrying. For over 2 centuries, the vast majority of African Americans were denied the simple human right to have their love recognized, protected, and sanctified by the state. Yet, despite this systemic erasure, the human spirit refused to be crushed. Enslaved men and women formed deep, passionate attachments, creating informal marital bonds and holding their own sacred ceremonies, such as jumping the broom, to bind their souls at the sight of God. But these were constantly subjected to the terror of forced separation. The wealth of slave owners was tied directly to the buying and selling of human flesh. At any moment, a husband can be sold to a plantation 300 miles away, or a wife can be traded to settle an owner's debt. Historians estimate that nearly 1/3 of all enslaved children in the Upper South were forcibly separated from their parents. Considering the heartbreaking historical reality of what we were known as abroad marriages, these were relationships where a husband belonged to one slaveholder and his wife and children belonged to the other, miles away on different plantations. After a grueling 14-hour day of backbreaking labor in the fields, an enslaved husband would wait until the dark of night, exhausted, with bleeding feet, and under the constant threat of being caught and brutally whipped by the slave patrols. He would walk 5, 10, or 15 miles through the woods just to spend a few precious hours holding his wife and whispering to his children. Before the first light of dawn, he would have to run back to his own plantation to avoid being classified as a runaway. Kind of psychological toll does it take on a human soul to love under such conditions? How do you open your heart fully to a partner or a child when you know with absolute certainty that they will be torn from your arms tomorrow and sold into a void from which they will never return? In his famous autobiography, the great abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass wrote a poignant anecdote about his childhood that illustrates the psychological destruction that he went through. Douglass was separated from his mother, Harriet Bailey, when he was just an infant. She was sent to work on a plantation miles away while he was left to be raised by an elderly woman. His mother would occasionally walk miles through the night just to lie next to him for a brief hour, whispering words of love to him while he slept, only to be gone before he woke. When she died, Douglas was not allowed to attend her funeral, nor did he even know of her death until long after. Douglas wrote with piercing psychological insight about the deliberate intent behind this cruelty. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it is to be hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. This is the birth of the ancestral bone. The system of white supremacy understood that the ultimate way to control a population was to disrupt their capacity for attachment, to blunt their natural affection, to make trust a liability, and to turn vulnerability into a weakness that could kill you. If you could make it too painful for a mother to love her child or for a man to love his woman, you could break their collective spirit. Generations of African American people had to learn how to love with one eye open. They had to develop a coping mechanism where they loved deeply but also held terrifying preparation for loss. When slavery ended, this survival strategy didn't vanish. It just became a ghost in the bedroom of every African American household, an inherited pattern of emotional caution passed down from grandmother to mother and from grandfather to son. In her research on post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Joy DeGruy explains that when a population experiences multi-generational trauma and is denied the opportunity to heal, they develop adaptive survival behaviors. These behaviors were highly functional under the terror of repression, but when passed down through generations without being examined, they can become deeply painful in modern relationships. One of the most profound concepts Dr. DeGroy introduces is that of the vacant esteem, a deep unconscious feeling of hopelessness, depression, and the belief that one has little to no worth, born from centuries of having your humanity denied. To defend against this vacant esteem and to survive an hostile outer world, African American men and women had to step into very specific, rigid, archetypal personas. The African American woman is and was initiated into the archetype of the strong black woman persona. This is the persona of myth, almost divine proportions. It traces its ancestry directly back to the enslaved woman who had to work the cotton fields under the scorching sun with her baby strapped to her back, return to the cabin to cook and care for her family, protect her children from the whip of the overseer, and to endure unspeakable physical and sexual violations, all while maintaining an air of calm. She was taught by history that she must be resilient, that she must never show weakness, and that her value was tied entirely to how much pain she can endure without breaking. But what happens to the girl inside who is tired? What happens to the woman who simply wants to be held, to rest, and to feel safe enough to lay her head down? That soft, vulnerable feeling self, the Oshun energy, if you will, of sweet, receptive waters, is pushed down deep into the dark basement of the shadow. Because in a world that continues to exploit and neglect her, vulnerability is seen as a moral liability. To show that you are hurting is to invite further harm. Thus, her capacity to receive care, her right to be fragile, and her deepest emotional needs are locked away. She retreats into a fortress of hyper independence, wearing her strength like a heavy crown, whispering to herself, I don't need anybody, I can do it on my own. At the same time, the African American man was forced to adopt his own shield in a society that historically sought to strip him of his manhood, his agency, his authority, and most importantly, his ability to protect his family. His physical and emotional survival depended on his ability to present a persona of self reliance. He had to be cool, detached, and emotionally untouchable. This is the origin of the Kubos. a psychological barrier of emotional flatness, physical toughness, and aloofness designed to hide deep anxiety, grief, and powerlessness that systemic oppression afflicted upon him. To survive, he was told by the streets and by the culture that he must never show fear, cry, and never admit that he does not know the way because he was denied access to traditional avenues of socioeconomic masculinity. His worth was often tied to his physical dominance, his financial hustle, or his ability to control his environment. The soft, tender parts of his nature, his capacity for deep emotional sensitivity, his need for gentleness, and his fear of failure were cast out into his shadow. Underneath the exterior of his masculine persona lies a deeply wounded boy who's terrified of being inadequate, of being powerless, and being unable to protect the ones that he loves. And when these two survivors come together in an intimate relationship, they carry the weight of their respective armors. On the surface, we see two independent and capable adults, but underneath, in the dark of the unconscious, their neglected shadows are starving because they have hidden their vulnerability from themselves. They cannot offer it to each other. They stand face to face, two armored castles, if you will, wondering why they feel so lonely when they are sleeping in the same bed. Instead of recognizing that they are both wounded by the same monster, they begin to hold each other responsible for their pain. The man blames the woman for her hardness and her lack of respect, and the woman blames the man for his emotional absence and his lack of consistency. They're fighting each other when they should be fighting the ghosts of the plantation. Now, this internal, not structure, but struggle, is not kept private. It is continuously amplified, shaped, and manipulated by the external world. In our modern digital age, the media acts as a projection screen, a psychological ward or mirror that is often distorted. In ancient Eastern philosophy, there is a concept called Maya, which refers to the illusion, or rather the great cosmic illusion that keeps us from seeing reality as it truly is. Today, our media, our social networks, and our digital algorithms have become the not the altruistic, but the ultimate architects of Maya. They do not profit from peace or healing or this idea of reconciliation. They profit from conflict, outrage, and division. If you open any social media app, if you watch modern television, or if you listen to popular culture, you will see this systemic pitting of African American men and African American women against each other. The algorithms of our time are designed to feed our worst insecurities. They take the rare, extreme, and toxic examples of relationship dynamics and broadcast them as if they were the universal truth of our lives. We are flooded with caricatures. On one side, we see the narrative of the untrustworthy, emotionally unavailable, cheating, parasitic man who only seeks to exploit and abandon. Opposite him, we see the narrative of the hyper-independent, angry, holy, and emasculating woman who does not need a man for anything and views companionship as transactional. These were not originally real African American human beings. They're cartoonish distortions. They are what Carl Jung would have called collective shadow figures. They are the psychological garbage of a society that refuses to look at its own systemic failures served back to us on high definition screens. This is the modern equivalent to divide and conquer, a strategy used by slaveholders to prevent collective rebellion. When we are constantly exposed to these toxic media narratives, they begin to seep into our unconscious minds. We start to look at our partners through the lens of suspicion. And African American man, or rather a black man, saturated with media narratives about female greed and manipulation, begins to view his partner's genuine emotional or material needs as financial demands. His inner protective wall goes up and he retreats into a cold and often defensive isolation. The black woman, or the African American woman, has ingrained stories of male betrayal from aunties, church mothers, and all of the above. And now her on social media talking about the lack of commitment and emotional infancy. It interprets her partner's silence or withdrawal not as exhaustion, depression, or fear, but as a sign of impending doom. Her internal critic hardens. She attacks his character and she retreats into her hyper independent fortress. This is the tragic, self fulfilling loop of collective trauma. We are being trained by our media to project our worst cultural nightmares onto the people we sleep next to. Treat our lovers not as individuals with their own unique hearts and histories, but as representations of a demographic we have been taught to fear. And in doing so, we commit an act of psychological violence. We strip our partners of their humanity, turning their faces into a replica of our own unexamined identities. Break the spell of division, we must understand the inner landscape of the psyche. Jung discovered that we do not just carry a shadow, we also carry a deep, intrasexual, I would say, soul image. Within every man, there is an unconscious feminine side called the anima. And within every woman, there is an unconscious masculine side called the animus. These are not literal physical men or women living inside our brains. They're archetypes, inherited ancient patterns of energy that represent the qualities of the opposite sex. Their primary purpose is to act as a bridge, just as our social mass, the persona, connects us to the outer world of society. The anima and the animus are meant to connect us to the inner world of the soul, to the collective unconscious, and ultimately to the spirit of life itself, right? So let us look at the enigma, the woman within the man. The enigma is the archetype of life itself. She represents feeling, relatedness, beauty, intuition, and the vital flow of emotional energy. For the black man who has historically been forced to shut down his feeling to survive, the integration of his enigma is his greatest spiritual task. It is truly his masterpiece. If a man completely unconscious of his anima, or if he is, she does not disappear. She simply goes into the shadow and expresses herself in destructive ways. Unconscious, neglected, Anima turns inward and becomes a vampire. She drains his life energy. The man sinks into a deep, dark, heavy, and mostly crazy, irrational moods. He wakes up feeling dull, heavy fatigue, a sense that nothing has any meaning. And if you're relating to this, keep it in here, and a deep, passive cynicism. He retreats into a world of wishful fantasy, dreaming about a perfect stress-free life rather than having the courage to build one. He may escape into a destructive pseudo-intellectualism, playing games with words and concepts on podcasts and social media to avoid making real, active, vulnerable decisions in his life. When he looks at his partner, his negative Anila projects a maternal shadow onto her. He begins to see her either as an overbearing mother who wants to control him or as a cold temperess who wants to drain his resources. He becomes hypersensitive, touchy, and easily offended, reacting to constructive feedback with the emotional petulance of an insecure child. But when a man does the hard work of making his anema conscious, when he honors his feelings, listens to his dreams, and allows himself to feel his grief and even his tenderness, his anema undergoes a beautiful transformation. She ceases to be a moody tyrant and becomes his inner guide. She endows him with an incredible capacity for deep relationship, emotional intelligence, artistic creativity, and spiritual depth. He no longer needs to wear the heavy, rigid mask of the tough guy. He can stand in his authentic and masculine power, the lightning and thunder of Shango, if you will, because he is now connected to his inner source of life. Now, let us look at the animus, the man within. The animus is the archetype of meaning, logic, structure, courage, and focused action. He represents the ability to articulate truth, to build boundaries, and to navigate the outer world with a sovereign authority. For the Black woman who has often had to carry the physical and economic survival of her family on her own, the animus is a familiar entity, huh? But if he remains unconscious, he can become a cold internal dictator. Negative unconscious animus expresses himself not in the emotional moods, but in rigid, unarguable convictions and opinions. It is that harsh, whispering voice in the back of a woman's mind that endlessly repeats, "You are entirely on your own. No one will ever protect you. If you show any weakness, you'll be destroyed. All men are unreliable and incompetent." This voice does not care about the actual messy and striving reality of the human being standing in front of her. It represents a cold, black and white worldview where there are only two options, and to be honest, both are bad. The negative animus cuts her off from her own heart, paralyzing her feelings and replacing them with a bitter, defensive intellectualism. He drives her into a state of hyper independence where she refuses to receive love or support, viewing any offer of help as an attempt to take her away from her freedom. When she projects this negative animus onto a partner, she sees him not as a companion, but as a useless, incompetent Negro who must be managed, criticized, and most importantly, controlled. But, but, when a woman tames her inner animus, when she recognizes the voice of judgment as an internal survival mechanism rather than absolute truth, animus becomes her greatest ally. He transforms into an inner warrior who gives her the courage to speak her truth with calm and unshakable objectivity. He provides her with the analytical strength to build her dreams, the capacity for profound reflection, and the spiritual wisdom to navigate life's challenges without losing her softness. Her Oshun like sweetness. She no longer needs to be the strong black woman who carries the universe. She can be a sovereign queen who knows how to rule her own life and how to welcome a king to it. In this book, Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert A. Johnson, he pointed out a strange and wonderful truth. Our shadow does not contain our dark, primitive, or destructive impulses. It also contains our most precious gold. The golden shadow represents our best qualities, our deepest sensitivity, our natural creativity, our capacity for profound joy, our nobility, and our power that we hid away because of our culture, our family, our history that told us we were not safe to express it. Think about this in the context of a historical African American experience. When survival is the primary exhausting goal, what are the things that get passed into the shadow? Is it the luxury of rest? Is it the permission to be soft? Is it the freedom to play, to trust, to be gentle, to surrender, to to our defenses. These are the gold coins of the human spirit. Because we have been trained for centuries to keep our guard up, we are deeply terrified of our own inner gold. We are afraid that if we soften, we would be crushed. We are afraid that if we trust, we would be betrayed. Robert Johnson wrote that humans will resist their own nobility even more strenuously than they hide their own dark sides. It is relatively easy to admit our flaws, but to acknowledge that we are carrying a beautiful soul, something precious within us, is terrifying. It demands that we step out of our comfortable roles as victims or survivors and take responsibility for our own light. Because we are too afraid to claim this gold within ourselves, we do what humans always do. We project it onto others. We look for a partner who can carry our gold for us. In the beginning of a romance, we fall into a state of intense, dizzying projection. We look at this new person, we see a god or a goddess. We see the answer to all of our prayers, the cure for all of our historical wounds. The Savior will make us feel whole. This is what we call falling in love. It is a beautiful, ecstatic experience, but it is also a form of psychological blindness. We are not actually seeing the human being in front of us. We are seeing our own golden shadow dressed up in their clothes. No human can survive being treated as a god. It is impossible and a crushing burden. Your partner is just a person, a beautiful, messy, struggling human being who has had bad breath in the morning, who gets tired, who makes mistakes, and who carries their own heavy sack of historical and personal trauma. Eventually, the golden projection must crack. The partner fails to live up to our divine expectations. They get grumpy, they forget to listen, or they reveal their own vulnerability. And on gold, our disappointment turns into a bitter. The Savior we once worshipped yesterday becomes the demon we condemn today. We accuse them of betraying us when in reality, the only committed crime was being human. The key to healing our relationships is the brave and difficult act of reclaiming our projections. We must have the courage to look at our partner and say, I am going to stop asking you to be my savior. I am going to stop demanding that you heal my childhood wounds or pay for the sins of my father. I am going to take my shadow back. When we take our gold back, our golden shadow, we begin to find our own strength, our own softness, and our own inner connection to the sacred. We find our own inner spirit, our own inner God. And we finally free our partner, ourselves, to be who we actually are. We allow them to be human. And that is the only state where they can truly love us. But the journey of love is a constant, delicate dance between two apparently contradictory needs. We have the need for connection, for unity, and for belonging. And we have the need for individuality, for freedom, and for our own unique path. Now, most people spend their entire lives caught in a painful war between these two needs. They think that they must choose. They think that to be in a relationship, they must sacrifice their freedom, erase their identity, and become a martyr. Or they think that to be free, they must remain isolated, cold, and often hyper independent. This is what we call the life of contradiction. It is a barren and exhausting place to live. It is heavy and it's like an unstable seesaw. One week we are clinging to our partner out of fear of loneliness and vacant esteem. And the next week we are pushing them away because we feel suffocated and controlled. We swing wildly between these two extremes, getting tired of the endless, involuntary round trips. But Carl Jung and Robert Johnson show us a different path. They called it the path of the paradox. A contradiction is a fight between two opposites where one side must win and the other must die. A paradox, however, is a holy place. where two contradictory truths are held together at the same time with equal dignity and, honestly, equal value. In a mature, conscious relationship, we must learn to hold the paradox of love. We must learn to say, I am completely whole and independent within myself, and yet I am deeply, vulnerably connected to you. I do not need you to survive, and yet I choose to love you with all my heart. I honor my path, and I want us to join in a shared journey. This is what I got right here. It's not an easy state of consciousness to reach. It requires a leap, a psychological maturity. It requires us to move away from childish need to always be right, to always be in control. When we are taught the war of opposites, we are looking for a villain and a hero. We want to say, I'm the good one who does everything right, and you are the bad one who runs everything. But if we're honest, we know that's a lie. We're both capable of great love and great selfishness. We are both creators and yet both destroyers. To enter a realm of paradoxes, to have the humility to admit that we are both carrying light and dark. It is to realize that our relationship struggles are not problems to be solved by changing our partner, but mysteries to be lived by changing ourselves. When we stay loyal to the paradox, when we refuse to split the world into us versus them, we earn the right to a deep wholeness. Now, in medieval Christian art, there is an ancient symbol that is rarely talked about today. It's called the Mandoria. The word Mandoria comes from the Italian word for almond. It's the almond-shaped segment that is created when two distinct circles overlap. In religious paintings, you will often see the figure of Christ or the Virgin Mary painted inside this almost almond-shaped overlap. This was an artistic choice. It was a psychological, spiritual map. By definition, Christ represents the intersection of two opposites, the divine and the human, the infinite and the finite, the heavenly and the earthly. The Mandorla is the symbol of reconciliation. It shows us how two completely different worlds can come together without destroying one another. Think of the two cities or the two circles as the black masculine and the black feminine. For centuries, these two circles have been pushed apart by historical trauma, systemic oppression, and social division, or they have violently forced to merge in unhealthy and mostly codependent ways, where one circle had to erase its identity to accommodate the other. Yes, shade. The mandorla offers us a third way. It tells us for true healing to occur, both circles must remain fully formed, strong, and distinct. The black man must stand fully in a circle rooted in his authentic and yet masculine power, connected to his inner feelings and carrying his own light. He must be a fully formed king. The black woman must stand fully in her circle, rooted in her sovereign feminine authority, clear in her boundaries, and holding up her own space. She must be a fully formed queen. And then they must consciously allow their circles to overlap. This overlapping space, the mandorla, is the holy ground of the relationship. It's not the place of compromise where we give up who we are. It is the place of creative tension, where we bring our differences together and allow them to make something new. It is in the mandorla that the black woman can finally lay down her armor. She does not have to be strong in the overlapping space because she is met by a man who is strong enough emotionally and spiritually to hold her fragility. She can finally rest. And it is in the mandorla that the impenetrable black man can lay down his shield. He don't gotta be cool, silent, or untouchable because he is met by a woman who has the emotional wisdom and grace to receive his fears and his tears without judging him, using it against him, seeing him as weak or inadequate. He can finally be seen. Our healing does not come from the light alone. It does not come from pretending that we have no wounds, no anger, and no shadow. The most profound experience we can have in this life is at the exact point where our light and our dark touch, where our history of pain meets our capacity for love. When we step into the Mandorla, we realize a liberating truth. We do not have to be perfect to be loved. We do not have to wait until we are completely healed to build a beautiful life together. The healing happens in the sharing of the wound. It happens when we look at each other's struggles and instead of using them as a weapon, we recognize them as a mirror in our own search for wholeness. Now, wrapping up, I want to tell you a story. Near the end of his life, the Danish philosopher, I believe, Soren Kierkegaard, wrote about the despair of the human existence. He described the life of a person who chases pleasures, status, and superficial relationships only to find themselves struck with a deep and often paralyzing, meaninglessness. Kierkegaard's solution to this despair was what he called the leap of faith. The conscious, courageous decision to step out of our logical defenses, surrender to our ego, and commit to something greater than ourselves. This is the exact leap we must take in our relationships to love consciously is to take that leap of faith. It is to decide that the connection between our souls is more important than our egos need to protect itself. It is to decide that we will no longer let our history dictate our destiny. The English poem William Blake wrote I would even call it prophetic work called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And he argued that we cannot have a true creative life if we only worship a sterile, one-sided goodness. He said that we must go to heaven for structure, order, and form, and we must go to hell for energy, passion, and fire, and we must marry the two. This is the ultimate goal of shadow work and black love. It is the marriage of our heaven and our hell. It is the courage to bring our energy out of the shadow and align it to our highest spiritual values. It is the refusal to live a half life of polite armored distance and the decision to enter the rich and messy and glorious reality of authentic relationship. People often ask Carl Jung during his final years if humanity would survive the massive cultural and political crises of the modern world. They wanted to know if we would destroy ourselves through war, division, and madness. Jung always gave the same simple answer. If enough people do their inner work, if the healing of the world does not begin in the halls of parliament or on the screens of our media, it truly does not. It begins in the privacy of our own hearts and in the sacred spaces of our homes. Every time a black man decides to look at his anger and find grief underneath it, he diminishes the collective shadow of the world. Every time a black woman decides to look at her hyper-independence and find the need for safety underneath it, she heals a piece of her ancestral. Every time two lovers decide to stop projecting their fears onto one another and instead step into this idea of this sacred mandorla of shared vulnerability, they're contributing to the evolution of human consciousness. Now, last thing, in his late masterwork, The Four Quartets, the poet T.S. Eliot wrote a line that summarizes truly the whole journey of human life. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crown knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. The fire of our suffering, our anger, our trials, and the rose of our beauty, our rebirth, and our love are not enemies. They are two halves of the same sacred circle. We have the courage to do the inner work to our own shadows and to honor the paradox of our life. The armor falls away. The guardian can be restored, and we are finally allowed to look at the person we love in the clear light of truth and to see that we were always. This has been another episode of Kimmy Apps. Y'all know I love you, but Jesus loves you more. Okay. Peace.